I took a passionate stance, as I always have, about common sense gun reform and expanding police ability throughout our country when we come in contact with someone mentally ill to take them to a facility to take guns away from them.
The school resource officer was behind a stairwell wall, just standing there, and he had his gun drawn and he was just pointing it at the building, and shots started going off inside.
AR-15s are different. They do catastrophic damage inside the human body that other weapons and ammunition are incapable of doing.
I'm not about taking anything by force. I'm not about.
Then why did you support a law that says that the state shall seize and take possession of these guns?
What I support is saving lives. And what saving lives is ban on assault rifles.
The repetitive, sensationalist script surrounding the phenomenon of the mass shooting goes something like this. Mass shootings are an epidemic, and so the government must further regulate firearms in order to prevent them from happening, until no mass shootings ever happen again. This is not a video about gun control or the ongoing debate about policy, but it's worth noting from the get-go that trends of violent crime have been on a downward slope for decades. The infamous mass shooting or school shooting tracks this national trend. A recent study by Northeastern University found that 4 times as many students were being killed at school in the early 90s compared to the present, with an average of 10 students being killed by gunfire each year over the course of 25 years. In other words, there is no epidemic here, and various changes in public policy over that length of time, such as the federal assault weapons ban of the 90s, appear to have had little or no effect. And so, in light of these new calls for more gun control in order to address this statistically insignificant problem, the term anarcho-tyranny comes to mind. Coined by the paleo-conservative writer Samuel Francis in 1992, the concept of anarcho-tyranny was essentially the predecessor to what we now call clown world. To quote Francis, "What we have in this country today, then, is both anarchy, the failure of the state to enforce the laws, and at the same time, tyranny, the enforcement of laws by the state for oppressive purposes, the criminalization of the law-abiding and innocent through exorbitant taxation, bureaucratic regulation, the invasion of privacy, and the engineering of social institutions, such as the family and local schools, the imposition of thought control through sensitivity training and multiculturalist curricula, hate crime laws, gun control laws that punish or disarm otherwise law-abiding citizens but have no impact on violent criminals who get guns illegally, and a vast labyrinth of other measures. In a word, anarcho-tyranny." And that, in a nutshell, is exactly what we're seeing in the background and aftermath of the shooting in Parkland, Florida. By now, you've most likely heard that the alleged shooter, Nicholas Cruz, was previously known to local police, the school district, and the FBI prior to the shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. It has been common for media personalities and social media users to say that the police and the school failed to prevent the shooting by ignoring Cruz's pattern of mentally unstable behavior and violent threats.
The schools failed, the local police failed, the Florida state bureaucracy failed, the officer on duty failed, the FBI failed. The government's first duty is protecting its citizens. They failed.
And indeed, many opportunities to take action against Cruz were passed by. It was later revealed by the neighboring Coral Springs Police Department that their officers arrived on the scene to discover that multiple Broward Sheriff's deputies were present on the campus and had not entered the school building where the shooting had unfolded.
The school resource deputy, Scott Peterson, is from Boynton Beach, and Sheriff Scott Israel says Peterson was spotted on surveillance video outside the freshman building at Stoneman Douglas High School.
After seeing video, witness statements, and Scott Peterson's very own statement, I decided this morning to suspend Scott Peterson without pay, pending an internal investigation. As is his right, Scott Peterson chose to resign.
The sheriff says Peterson waited 4 minutes outside the school. Past reports show the entire attack that left 17 students and teachers dead took somewhere between 3 and 6 minutes.
Yes, the same Scott Peterson who had previously been made aware multiple times of Cruz's unstable and threatening behavior. This is where the concept of anarcho-tyranny becomes more viscerally real. You might find yourself asking, why would so many interactions between Cruz, his family, and the police, school officials, and the FBI slip through the cracks? How could the system have failed at so many different points? The answer is that it didn't. The Broward Sheriff's Office and Broward School District have, for several years, engaged in a deliberate social engineering program to avoid arresting criminal students within their jurisdiction. In a previous video entitled Mass Shooting Mythology, I alluded to disparate impact policy, under which government institutions try to alleviate perceived discrimination against minorities and other disadvantaged youth by changing the way they enforce, or rather don't enforce, the rules. And Broward County is a perfect example of disparate impact at work. From American Prospect, Reversing Broward County's school-to-prison pipeline, the story behind the so far successful crusade to end disproportionate student arrests and suspensions in one Florida school district. When, after a nationwide search, he was hired 2 years ago to serve as superintendent of Florida's Broward County Public Schools, Robert Runcie began brainstorming ways to close the racial achievement gap. At the time, black students in the 6th largest district in the country had a graduation rate of only 61% compared to 81% for white students. To find out why, Runcie, who once headed a management consulting firm, went to the data. One of the first things I saw was a huge differential in minority students, black male students in particular, in terms of suspensions and arrests, he says. Black students made up 2/3 of all suspensions during the 2011 to 2012 school year, despite comprising only 40% of the student body. And while there were 15,000 serious incidents like assaults and drug possession reported that year, 85% of all 82,000 suspensions were for minor incidents, use of profanity, disruptions of class, and 71% of all 1,000 plus arrests were for misdemeanors. The last statistic, says Runcie, was a huge red flag. Broward's collaborative agreement on school discipline was announced in early November of 2013. Instead of suspensions, students can now be referred to the Promise program, where they receive counseling for several days and then return to school. A host of non-violent misdemeanors no longer require an arrest, though officers can sometimes override that if they feel it's necessary. I wanted to make sure deputies always had discretion, says Scott Israel, Broward County Sheriff. The school district's Office of Minority Male Achievement reviews data to ensure that punishments for minor infractions and racial disparities are on the decline. The 2013 agreement between Broward County Schools and Broward Sheriff's Office specifies the nonviolent misdemeanors for which students would no longer be arrested. Threats, disorderly conduct, criminal mischief, and harassment are all included within the list. Cruz would have failed the background checks for his firearms had he been convicted of domestic violence charges, or of making threats to harm or kill his family members, faculty, and fellow students, or had been involuntarily committed to a mental health institution, as he could have been numerous times on all counts. Broward Sheriff's Office, like all police departments, want their crime numbers to look good. Broward schools want their disciplinary and expulsion numbers to look good, and also want to secure federal funding for their district. Under the Obama-era Promise program, disparate impact initiatives like the collaborative agreement were the path to all of the above. But what about the events of the shooting itself? What about Officer Peterson and his so-called failure to intervene in the shooting as it was happening? You might well wonder if he'll face consequences for his cowardice and inaction. Well, Anarcho Tyranny world gets even better. Unfortunately for the general public, law enforcement officers are given a massive level of protection from liability when their incompetence or negligence causes harm to members of the public. For example, Warren versus District of Columbia, a 1981 case heard in the District of Columbia Court of Appeals, held that police do not owe a specific duty to provide police services to citizens based on the public duty doctrine, also known as the duty to rescue. The details of the case pertain to a 1975 incident in which 3 women who shared a rooming house were abducted by intruders. Upon hearing the intruders enter the house and attack their downstairs roommate, 2 of the women phoned 911 and informed dispatch that they had been burglarized. The call was relayed to officers on the street as a Code 2 assignment, even though a crime in progress should have been prioritized as a Code 1 assignment. 3 officers responded to the call at the rooming house. The 2 women had crawled out their window onto an adjacent roof, waiting for the police to arrive. While they hid on the roof, they witnessed officers drive through the alley behind the house, without ever stopping or even getting out of their vehicle. Another officer knocked on the front door and left when the door went unanswered. All told, the police left the scene within 5 minutes of arriving, leaving the 2 women on the roof and the third still trapped with the intruders. They called 911 again, but this second call was never dispatched to officers on the street. In the end, all 3 women were abducted, taken to one of the intruders' apartments, and forced to perform sexual acts for 14 hours. They went on to file complaints of negligence against the DC Metro Police Department. In a 4-3 decision, the District of Columbia Court of Appeals affirmed the trial court's dismissal of the complaints against the District of Columbia and individual members of the Metropolitan Police Department based on the public duty doctrine, ruling that the duty to provide public services is owed to the public at large, and absent a special relationship between the police and an individual, no specific legal duty exists. A similar case, Town of Castle Rock versus Gonzalez, heard by the U.S. Supreme Court in 2005, held that a town and its police department could not be sued for failure to enforce a restraining order. In this case, the Castle Rock police's failure to enforce the restraining order led to the murder of a woman's 3 children by her estranged husband. Because she had allowed him limited access to the children as per the restraining order, the police chose not to intervene when he had taken the children against her will in violation of the order. She called the police multiple times throughout the abduction incident, and no action was taken until her husband showed up at the police station with the children already dead in the trunk of his car. These cases hinge on the legal concept of qualified immunity, with which government officials and employees can be shielded from liability unless their actions are found to violate an individual's constitutional rights. Now, this is not to say that police are given leeway to simply not do their job, but under the current legal precedent, an officer who fails to fulfill or even chooses not to fulfill that duty is very likely to get a slap on the wrist, if any punishment at all. So if you're caught up in the debate that followed in the wake of Marjory Stoneman Douglas, and you want to make the argument that I don't need the ability to protect myself and my family because the police will do it for me, then you better make sure that's actually true before you demand that I accept any more limitations on my right to protect myself. The Stoneman Douglas shooting could have been prevented at dozens of different junctures had law enforcement and the school district seen fit to do their job. This was not a mistake or an accident or a failure of law enforcement. They intentionally ignored the warning signs just so they could say, we're being nicer to the disadvantaged kids. And now the event is being used as a justification to solve what would otherwise be a non-issue if the police were interested in that whole to protect and serve thing. We refuse to control real criminals. That's the anarchy. So we control the innocent. That's the tyranny.
When they give us that inch, that bump stock ban, we will take a mile. We are not here for breadcrumbs, we are here for real change.
3 high-ranking Florida officials are expressing their frustration because they say EMS was delayed getting inside Stoneman Douglas High School on the day of the shooting in the critical moments when victims lay inside in need of immediate care. One source tells Fox News some EMS teams requested to go inside but were denied by the commanding agency, the Broward County Sheriff's Office.
Classes at West Hills High School in Santee continued as normal Wednesday, but the vibe was much different after a student made threatening messages on Instagram.
I didn't see the post, but as soon as I came in to school, that's all everybody was talking about.
The post, according to authorities, was a picture of an AR-15 rifle made out of Legos, and to go along with it, a caption that read, "Don't come to school tomorrow," putting some students on edge.